Hi, my name is Mallory Whitfield, and today I'm going to be speaking with Stephanie Castillo about diversity and belonging in STEM fields. So STEM, if you're not familiar, is science, technology, engineering, and math. We'll also talk a little bit about that and the difference between that and STEAM, which is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. So Stephanie is a science communication Ph.D. student. She's currently working on her Ph.D. at Vanderbilt University, which is where I was first introduced to her work. She has a project called Phuture Doctors, which I'll let her explain more about. But she is doing amazing work to create communication so that people can understand the importance and the awesomeness of STEM fields. So let's dive in. Hi, Stephanie. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us about Phuture Doctors and what it is and what inspired this project.
Yeah, so Phuture Doctors is hopefully will be a media company that will change the way scientists are shown on screen. And so I was kind of inspired by a lot of the science YouTube that I watch, but most of the people that host those types of channel are usually one type of demographics. They're just like older males, typically like white cis and their late 30s or something, but they also portray to an audience of like more educated and more like college educated type of audience as well. So I wanted to bring in the science, but also make sure that there's representation in each of these videos. So I am interviewing my colleagues at the university who are all from different racial, cultural, whatever types of other identifiers, backgrounds, and just giving them a platform to talk about their awesome science, but also highlighting the diversity within science too. So that's what I got going.
Yeah. Well, and okay, so you're trying to showcase like this, the wide representation of who can and does participate in science, right?
Yeah.
And I think you touched on something like there does tend to be, science for a very long time, or STEM fields for a very long time have been sort of predominantly white, male, cis, able-bodied, et cetera. And I know that there's been this push to encourage like people from underrepresented backgrounds, have more women in STEM. And I've seen some talk around like having a sense of belonging within STEM tends to increase, how long people stay in those fields, right? Because there can be a drop off. People get interested, but then if they don't feel like they belong working in that or studying those STEM fields, they might drop off and look for something else. Can you speak to that and like what you've seen and experienced personally when it comes to belonging in STEM?
Yeah, so before going into like my personal experience, I think most of the literature, the studies that have kind of been out there, there's very different aspects on what kind of keeps someone or what affects someone's sense of belonging within STEM. And so it can either be, an underrepresented minority in a very predominantly white institute. It could be that they're not getting the respect from their peers or their professors, and so kind of like being ousted makes someone want to continue into the field. But as well as representation. So, if there's not, as a Hispanic person, if I'm not seeing other Hispanic professors, then I'm kind of like, well, is this a place for me? Does anyone understand what my cultural background affects? I'm also like the first person in my family to go to college, so also having like that first generation type of background. It's just like, okay, well, how do if I have these peers that have other parents that already taught them the way, then like how do I know how to navigate this space and not having another professor or anyone in this department understand my experience also makes me feel like then this place is not really meant for me. I think I never really, I liked science in high school, and then, there's only like the main categories of like, oh, there's physics, there's history, or there's math and science. And I was just like, okay, well, science is like the most decent one. So I guess I'll continue in that one. But it wasn't until when I went to community college that I actually had like a professor who was a Hispanic woman. And I was like struggling. Like I pretty much failed most of my exams until I got to the point where I went to her office hours and I was like, hey, I really need your help. So it was actually her like taking the time to like, work these problems out for me, and me having a deeper understanding of chemistry, but also like seeing her and her being able to do this is what kind of like, okay, you know, like maybe I do have what it takes to be a scientist, because I grew up watching Bill Nye the Science Guy. So you just kind of have this weird stereotype of like a genius, crazy, you know, a genius kind of white guy with crazy hair. It's like, who can be a scientist? But I kind of went along the traditional path of, I graduated from university, or I transferred from community college to university. I also had a lot of research professors as well, that were also Hispanic, people from like my home country, which is Venezuela. So I was surrounded by diversity. So it was awesome to see that, and also like be acknowledged and valued for that. But it wasn't until I got into my Ph.D. chemistry program is where there was like a culture shock. I went from going from Orlando, Florida, where my hometown and my university, super diverse, to then coming to Nashville, which is, you know, some like still has a weird sense of like segregation kind of happening, to be honest. And so I was in that university, and then it was only like a month or like a year in when I was told that like the way I spoke was very master's material than PhD material, whatever that meant. And so that kind of like, you know, and then reflecting on like who is in my department, there was no other minority faculty there to really understand kind of the mentorship that I needed. And so that's where I kind of dove into looking at the bigger picture of like, okay, well, this is a widespread problem of the fact that there's lack of diversity in these higher positions, especially in higher education. And so that's where I decided to start Phuture Doctors and dive into that. But diving into that and building that community has also reinforced the importance of having diversity in these spaces, and also valued, like, I still belong, I still have what it takes to be a PhD. And yeah, so that's my journey for the most part.
Yeah. Well, and so like, I think you've spoken to the importance of having other people, you know, who look like you, kind of represent like your similar background in like leadership positions, right? Like having those teachers or having those mentors. But beyond that, like, what are some tangible ways that do you think we could create more sense of belonging, both in school, even at younger ages, right? Like starting in like elementary, middle school, high school, through college, as well as in the workforce, like whether, you know, we want to be allies to other people and create more sense of diversity and belonging, or, you know, just to foster that in any way. What are some things that do you think we could do to create more of that?
Oh man, that's a good question. It's like, you know, I think one thing that I've been discussing with some friends is that like sometimes the problem with using the word like diversity is that it ends up becoming just kind of like a buzzword just to get more people of color into these spaces, but we're not actually bringing them into an environment where they're valued for their skills. So it's really hard, like the people that do want to bring on diverse perspectives from whatever type of background, like they really have to be in the mindset that they're valuing the person for their skills and not just trying to check a box off that they're a Black or Indigenous or queer type of person going into this space. So it really takes a lot of reflecting from whatever company it is to actually like have that initiative, or what's the word I'm looking for? The intent, I guess. I don't know what the word is, but I guess like having that intent in mind. But, you know, if they're already with this movement, a lot of companies are trying to shift that environment. And so another way is that it's just cultivating a community. I think community is also a big thing in the sense of like, you know, instead of having like forced happy hours at work, you know, or forcing diverse people to be on these diverse boards and being like tokenized to speak on the behalf of whatever representation that they're trying to do, is like really fostering a way that like everyone that's at the table has the chance to speak and hear each other out and respect each other, and just have like a really sense of like family community within that work environment. And so I think that can speak on like the STEM workforce itself. But in terms of like a younger education, or a younger like in elementary school, there is this movement called Skype a Scientist that happens, and it's actually bringing, just like we're doing the telecommunication, you get to bring scientists into the classroom. So, and that's a way that teachers actually have a broad scope of the type of scientists that they're showing to their students at a younger age. So I think for younger demographic representation, I think is the most valuable piece of tool we can use to cultivate that sense of belonging, or spark that sense of inspiration, and allow students to see themselves represented in a field that they probably never even knew about or can dream about. But yeah, I wonder, yeah, that's a really good question, because it's like,
yeah. Well, and so as we're talking about this, I had a couple of different things that I've sort of read or encountered recently that come to mind. So I was reading this article about math, and how like a lot of times young girls at a certain age, they're, pretty equivalent in terms of like skills, right? But then there's these cultural things that as they get older, they either get told by teachers or parents like, oh, you're not naturally as good at math because you're a girl, even though there's like no science to really back that up. It's all just cultural stuff.
yeah.
And I was reading about this woman based in Toronto. I forget her name right now, but she does work around trying to make math cool, basically trying to change the cultural ideas around math.
She have like that club, like it was like a cafe, like a math cafe. You can come in there. Yeah.
Yes. And so it feels very like kind of fun and girly, and, to make it feel really comfortable in a different way, to try to change the cultural dynamic around it.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking too, a friend of mine was talking, he has it's his girlfriend's daughter, who's I think around 12 or 13, and who is very sort of like wants to be a scientist, very mathy, but very recently realized that she wants to read more novels, but had told herself this narrative that people who like science, or people who are, sort of into STEM type of things, don't like creative things.
Yeah.
Right. And so he was asking for recommendations of, like female scientists who also love to read novels. Yeah. We have all these narratives. So like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's weird, like where these stereotypes come from. Again, it's just like we like growing up watching Bill Nye the Science Guy. Like, I thought that was cool. Like, I don't know. It's hard because we have like two different ways of just like people that like science, like purely because they love science, but then there's also people that are like, you guys have potential, but, but you have potential, but just because you don't believe that you fit into this box of what you think a scientist is, and you kind of like push yourself back. But I think we have to kind of think again that it's just like scientists are just people. Like me as a scientist, I like, I wasn't really good. Like I was like a mediocre student. I got like B's and C's, and I really had to work hard to get the things that I want. But at the same time, I actually wanted to be a photographer before going into STEM. But again, we have like the stereotypes of just like an artist is like a starving artist, so it's like you're like, my parents pushed me more to go into science. But I found a way now through science to bring in that my creativeness, and that you having those different types of hobbies or interests can also help cultivate you to be a different and unique scientist that has value to solving the problems that we need to solve. And so, like now I incorporated my love for photography. So through filming, I'm now doing like science communication, which is using video as a medium to talk about science. There's a way to create that for yourself. So it's like, if this person, I don't know, that's, hold on real quick. I think, I think we're recognizing that maybe more on social media, where I have friends who love makeup. They're really good makeup artists. And now they're using their face as like a canvas to like communicate science. There's a way to bring both and not feel ashamed for it, but also value that you have the ability to be so creative, but analytical through your science, and how do you combine those two to merge both of your passions? But that's interesting you mentioned that, because I remember reading a paper too. They did a study to test, it was for a physics class. So they're making a video, and in the background, I have like all my little animation figures, but they made their background like purposefully very science heavy. And when they showed it to their classroom, most of the males in the classroom actually like were drawn more to the video, where the females in the classroom were kind of like, they kind of lost interest. But when they made the background of their video very like neutral, in the sense of just like, it wasn't very like nerdy posters, so it's just very like some cool art or whatever, then more of the females were actually forced into it. So it's crazy how like nuances like that change your perception of your stereotype of like who can do science, or re-emphasizes the stereotype that you have in mind. So I think it's now as we continue on, I feel like I'm rambling, but now as we continue on and we're recognizing the value of having everyone's unique identity acknowledged and represented and not praised, what's the word, but like, I don't know, like we're uplifting it, I think we're more bringing our unique backgrounds to the forefront to try to demystify the stereotypes that we've continued to harness.
Yeah. Well, and I think identity is something that seems like a big part of this, right? As we were talking about belonging in STEM, because, to your point about not wanting to have companies just want to check off the box of having XYZ type of person added to their team. And it really needs to be like much deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
But it's also like, in terms of these identities, like, oh, I am a scientist, therefore I can't like creative things, or I am a artist, therefore I can't like,
mm-hmm.
I think we often have this tendency to want to put people in these boxes where like they're mutually exclusive, or like our identity is distilled down into these one or two narrow things. And like, that's not how people are.
Exactly. I don't know, but it's weird, but it's like, well, why do we, that can be like a whole nother conversation, but it's like, why do we go down to that? Why do we feel like we have to, like now we're changing the definition of like gender expression, and it took a long time for people to respect that, gender's like on a spectrum. It's like, why can't we do that with like the different types of identities that we have?
Yeah.
And it's just because and it's important, because it's like, I remember reading or seeing a video that a mentor of mine created where there's these doctors trying to find a cure, or not a cure, but they're trying to find some type of, there was a type of demographic that kept getting some type of infection. And they were trying to understand like, why were more Hispanics getting this type of infection compared to like everyone else. And they were like so confused and contemplating and trying to understand. And it wasn't until like this Puerto Rican professor was like, oh, this is because like culturally they're going to be doing more of this. So it was because of him, from that background, he was able to identify that, whereas like people outside of that are never going to understand or even like acknowledge or know the cultural nuances that can help solve these problems. So I think that's where that's where it's important to recognize our differences between each of these people, and how each of our differences can bring a unique perspective to the table. But it's a good question. Like, I wonder why, even still, as we're trying to like shift the narrative, like why is it so hard for all of us to kind of, I don't know, that's also generalizing, but kind of hard for us to kind of break these stereotypes or pictures of what we think someone should be.
Yeah. Yeah. And try to like fit it into those like narrow boxes. I mean, even I've always been a very creative person. But I tend to sort of be a little ADD. Like I have a lot of different creative interests, right? Like I like visual art, I like video, I like being on stage, dancing, and all these things. And I had this realization a few years ago when I sort of realized a lot of the people, both like artists that I knew personally and, famous influences in my life, I was like, they are these kind of people that are constantly evolving and pulling from all these different inspirations, right? Like I'm not drawn to the type of artist who's only done this one narrow type of thing their entire life, right? Like I like people who really are immersed in all sorts of different things and curious about the world.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like, do you have specific inspirations as far as like STEM, you know, scientists or people that you've really looked up to that have been inspirations for you, that, you know, people that we might be able to check out, like whether it's a famous scientist or like an author or.
Yeah. Oh man. Oh man. I don't know. Oh, that's a good question. Cause I think I'm like inspired by my peers, cause I'm okay. So with Phuture Doctors, we're now in a time where like science communication is kind of like on the rise compared to just like a like hard hitting STEM fields. It's important to be able to communicate the research that's being done to whatever type of audience. And so like I was saying before, like I was really interested in photography. So it's just kind of like I want to bring in that kind of like creative eye into my science communication. And so oh man, this is a good question. I never really thought about it. Like I have to give kudos to Bill Nye the Science Guy because I was raised on that, but also like the style of editing that the PBS channel did is kind of similar to kind of the editing and the humor that you see now, like on TikTok and like popular media, which is really weird, kind of like the 90s flair kind of coming back again. Let me look real quick. Science Sam is a really, really good science communicator. But she is a neuroscientist. She got her PhD in neuroscience, but now she is like pretty much like the face of translating science from different types of fields, but she's also very heavily involved in like making sure that our science communication is inclusive. So Science Samus is a person that I kind of look up to. In terms of video, I don't know. Do you know the studio? Have you seen Euphoria?
No, I don't think so.
Oh man, it's like a really heavy, it's a teen drama, but meant for like adults to watch it because it was like very R. But the people that produce the people that produce the show, like the media company that produced this show is called A24. And I really like the A24 studio because they created, have you seen the movies like Midsommar? I don't know if you're into like scary movies or anything.
Oh, I've heard of that one. I'm not so much a horror movie person, but I've heard of that one. Yeah.
But like aesthetically, visually, like it's such a beautiful film, the way that things are shot. And I don't know if it's just like the style or the studio, but the studio has like it's like a weird uniqueness that you know it's from like A24. So I want to bring in that inspiration of like that type of like cinematography into the work of like being able to communicate science like Science Sam, but also have like that humor, that uniqueness from like Bill Nye the Science Guy and like the nostalgia. So I'm like, that's how I'm kind of pulling in the different facets of like trying to create something unique.
Yeah.
The work that I make in the future.
Well, and I think the work that you're doing with this science communication, right? Because this is kind of an emerging field. Isn't this what your PhD is on?
Yeah.
Can you talk more? Because I think it's really cool. Like, so I have a background in marketing, and I've become in that field a lot of times kind of a tech translator for technical things like search engine optimization to try to explain it in simpler language so that small business owners can understand it, right? Because similarly to a lot of science concepts, there's these things that seem so technical if you're not familiar with it at all. And it kind of takes people who understand the science or the technical aspects well enough so that then they can translate it into a more clear language so that even a little kid could get it. And I think it's really important. Can you talk more about this like science communication work?
Yeah, I feel like it's been around for a while because science communication is like broad in the sense of just like when you think of the word communication, it's kind of like between, you know, it's a dialogue that's happening between two entities or whatever. And so the science component comes in, it's just like at first we would think it's about a technical person or like a scientist talking to a non-expert, but it can either be between two experts or two non-experts. It's just about the connection and the dialogue that's happening between. So science communication can be like in a written format, kind of how you were saying, where, you know, if I were to have this instruction manual, you know, how do I translate this really dense instruction manual in a way that's more concise and more understandable to like a person that's going to pick up from IKEA, you know, like, and And then there's, so, well, we can even think about like COVID right now, like the CDC, there's people there's science communicators. So there's people that's working to translate the research that's going on to that's ever evolving on trying to keep up with like how we're understanding the coronavirus, this new strain of coronavirus, and translating it so then the public can understand. But it's like, you know, there's going to be people that are good at it, not good at it. but again, it's just like, how do we take the research that's going on at NASA or you know, these medical institutions or even in the university level? How are we taking these complex science concepts that these experts know, and how do we bring it down and use everyday terminology to explain and to be transparent about the work that's being done, why it's important, how it's impacting our lives, and why we should care. Like, these are things that's going to help kind of bridge the gap of like the public understanding the importance of science and how it affects their lives. And also know, like, you know, to be kind of like, I don't know, political or whatever, but like to know like where how our taxes or our money is being funneled into these things for the research to better benefit us again in the long run. And so there can be written science communication, which is like, you know, reading a magazine or learning about the science through a magazine. There's outreach as a form of communication. So it's like scientists or experts going into the classroom to show you science experiments. There's video science communication, which is like what I'm aspiring to do, and kind of like what we see on Science YouTube with like Smart Every Day, Veritasium, Physics Girl. Like, those are science communicators used through a medium platform. And so it's all about pretty much, how do we understand these complex concepts that only that experts are like continuously evolving their terminology, but it's so technical. How do we bring it down so then we can just, like, you know, the normal everyday person can understand, or a child can understand. And so I think that's a skill in it of itself. And that's why it's important to have like professional science communicators in the field to be that bridge between the expert and the public, and to help build that trust between each other.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so important. Right. And this reminds me of, like, I don't know if you have any thoughts about STEAM versus STEM, because I feel like that STEAM, where it adds arts in the middle of the STEM acronym, has gotten more traction.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on like using one acronym versus another?
Yeah. I think, again, it's just kind of like, you know, it's important to have that. Everyone just kind of changes it depending on like what the goal is, you know. So if we're just talking about, if we're trying to inspire more kids or younger people to be interested in, kind of like bringing back to how you're saying your friend wants someone who's like a scientist but also likes novels, like that's where it's important to bring in the STEAM aspect of it, because even science communication can be visual, like, you know, visual art. And, you know, a painting about a cell, like a animal cell, like that's important to bring in. I think the distinguish is kind of like what the goal is. If I'm just talking about research, then I'm just going to stick with just STEM, you know. But if we're talking about like cultivating an environment, and, you know, to bring everyone together, and everything is all encompassing in terms of like this goal that we're trying to establish, and bringing the arts is important to come into. So I think, you know, it's just kind of like a new word, like what, you know, what is the value of, like, what is the purpose of using, whether including art or not. So with science communication, then science communication itself would be more STEAM in terms of just STEM, because we're bringing that artistic creative element in order to find a new way to communicate to whoever we are, to our audience.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So starting to wrap up, like, what is one resource that has been totally life-changing for you? It could be a movie or a person or a book. It doesn't even have to be related to STEM, but
Yeah.
what's one thing that really changed your life that you would recommend somebody check out?
Oh man, there's this channel called Seeker. I have like friends who are professional science communicators that speak on this YouTube channel. And this YouTube channel is all about like science, mostly about like medical and like space science, but they're that's like a nice, an awesome way, an awesome channel that really shows the importance of like science communication and how it can be made in a way that's entertaining and valuable for anybody that comes across the video to watch and see and learn something new. So Seek is really good. If you're someone that's creative and like a little bit around like a little older or like wanting to start their own like their own endeavor into like being creative, there's this podcast called Creative Pep Talk. It's kind of like awesome because it's like, even though I'm a scientist, I wasn't trained to be, I really had to come up with my own path to be a science communicator, but also had to teach myself to bring back the creative aspect into my science work, and how do I make that into like a business. So Creative Pep Talk is also a cool pop podcast that has kind of helped me be less reserved and like less like shy about like trying to be more creative and embrace that aspect of me more, and how I incorporate it into the work that I'm doing with science. And then just to learn more about like science stories, there's a podcast called Her STEM Story. And it's a podcast where this is highlighting the different diverse women in STEM and their journeys into STEM. And that's also like a really inspiring podcast that I listen to.
Nice.
Yeah.
If you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice, what would you tell her?
Ooh, people are going to tell you you're not going to be able to do something. It's going to hurt for a little bit, but just know that you like, just to not give up, and that I have it in myself to continue to push forward and create and be a trailblazer and whatever I want to be that will make me happy. And so that's it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good advice. Good advice. So where can people find you and connect with you and find out more about Phuture Doctors?
Yeah, so I'm active on mostly Instagram. It'll be at Phuture Doctors, so PH with the PH, PHUTRE, DOCTORS. And then I have a website. I took a hiatus into making videos, but with my Ph.D. dissertation, I'm trying to learn ways to like actually make my science communication videos more relatable. So that's part of my research project. So hopefully once I'm done with that, I can start releasing more videos soon. But if you visit my website, futuredoctors.com, I have scientists that I featured and the small videos that I've made. And you can connect me both through my website or through Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mallory.